All right, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff. We're going to be looking at this MP3 titled Civil War for Control of the U.S. Government Has Erupted. And, as you might guess from that title,
Oh,
it's hosted by a guy who calls himself the voice of reason. He's kind of a right-wing commentator. And, our goal here isn't to,
right.
tell you what to think or anything like that. We just want to
Yeah.
break this source down. What's he saying? What's his argument?
Yeah.
And what does it mean, for us, especially kind of in the world we're living in today, with all this political stuff.
Well, I've probably heard people talking about like a second civil war in the U.S.
Mhm.
And, this source kind of takes it to a whole other level. He says, like, it's already happening.
Really?
Yeah. But here's the thing. He says it's not like, the kind of war with soldiers in battlefields, at least not yet. He's saying
Mhm.
it's more like this deep division, like this fight for control over like the institutions that govern us.
Oh, wow. Okay. So he's saying,
Yeah.
this war is being fought, like, within the government itself or something like that.
Exactly.
Huh. Well, he uses some pretty strong language to describe this whole thing. Like, he says it's a war between Donald Trump and something he calls the deep state.
Hmm.
I'm sure, a lot of people listening have heard that term before. But, what does it actually mean in this context?
Right. That's where it gets really interesting. He's basically saying the deep state is this like network of unelected officials, like bureaucrats,
Right.
all the people working behind the scenes. And they're the ones who like hold on to the power no matter who wins an election.
Regardless of who the president is or anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he paints them as like almost a shadow government. They're working against like the will of the people, he says.
So they're the ones really pulling the strings, in his view.
Yeah, and specifically against Trump.
Against Trump, okay. And, this whole idea of unelected officials having all this power, it's not like some crazy conspiracy theory.
No, right, absolutely not.
We've seen examples in the real world,
Right.
like where these agencies maybe overreach.
Exactly. Like bureaucratic overreach, intelligence agencies may be going too far. It's a real concern.
Yeah.
And that's part of why, this rhetoric can be so powerful. It plays on these anxieties that people already have about, who really holds the power.
So it's tapping into something real, you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay, so then if we're going by what this source says, does the evidence he presents,
Right.
does it back up his claims about this deep state war on Trump?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
We got to look at the evidence.
Well, he does try to present some, and some of it is pretty intense.
Okay.
Like, he points to these violent clashes we've seen.
At political events.
Exactly, yeah. Like, even going back to Trump's inauguration.
Right.
And the protests in Berkeley.
The Berkeley protests, yeah, those were wild.
For those who don't remember, those were a series of
Like-
demonstrations on the UC Berkeley campus.
Mhm.
And they turned violent. And he uses these events as proof that, these political tensions,
Yeah.
they've escalated to a really dangerous level.
Okay, but hold on a second. It's important to like analyze this carefully, right?
Yeah, first.
Are these isolated events or are they actually part of a bigger trend? Like, is political violence actually increasing in the U.S.? And then, how much of this can we really blame on Trump or his policies specifically?
That's a good point. Okay, so then he also brings up boycotts as evidence of this war.
Interesting.
Specifically the Kellogg's boycott.
I remember that one.
Yeah, that happened after they pulled their ads from Breitbart.
Right.
And then there were boycotts against companies linked to Trump's family.
Mm-hmm.
And he paints this as an economic war, like they're trying to punish Trump and his supporters.
Yeah. It's interesting because he's tapping into this whole history of boycotts, like as a tool for change, right? Social and political change. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott, or, even more recently, the boycott of Nestle over their practices, overseas. So boycotts have been used by, well, everyone, really, both the left and the right. So the question is, are these examples really proof of a new civil war? Or is it just, more of the same, just a tactic that's always been around?
I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Okay, so it doesn't stop there. He even makes some pretty wild claims about the deep state spying on Trump.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he brings up this report from USA Today
Okay.
about phone calls that were intercepted. And he claims that's proof, that they're trying to undermine the president.
Okay, so we need to dig a little deeper here. Like, what did the USA Today report actually say? Did they find any evidence that these intercepts were illegal or that they were politically motivated, or could there be, other explanations?
Right, like it would.
Well, maybe it was just part of, a routine intelligence operation,
Hmm.
or maybe they were investigating foreign interference, something like that.
Yeah.
These are all things we need to consider before we jump to any conclusions.
Okay, that's a good point. And then he also mentions this former NSA analyst
Okay.
who tweeted that Trump will die in jail.
Oh, wow.
And he uses that tweet as an example of, just how far things have gone, how dangerous this whole war is becoming.
Yeah, that's a pretty disturbing tweet for sure. Especially, given how heated things have become. It definitely highlights the danger of using this kind of extreme language and, how it could
Oh,
potentially lead to violence.
right.
But is one tweet, even from someone who used to work for the NSA, is that really proof that there's some big plot against the president?
I guess not by itself. It's important to note that, he's presenting all of this
Right.
through a very specific lens, right?
Mhm.
He's using really strong language
Yeah.
to create this feeling of like urgency and danger. He talks about a coup d'etat, calls his opponents seditious.
Wow.
He even compares the U.S. to Venezuela under Maduro.
Huh. That's a pretty extreme comparison.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's like he's trying to shock people, make them believe that the situation is so bad, so out of control that we need to take drastic action.
Right.
He's using this fear to build his case for what he calls a house cleaning. But before we get into that,
Yeah.
I think we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I agree. Before we get swept up in all this, we need to ask ourselves, like, is this really a realistic picture of what's happening in the U.S.? Or is it just a story he's created
Yeah.
to get a reaction out of people?
And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dives. We'll dig into his perspective, analyze his rhetoric, and consider what the consequences of this kind of framing might be. Before we go any further, we really need to unpack the language this source is using. It's pretty loaded, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not subtle.
No, not at all. He doesn't just present facts or anything. He's really painting this vivid picture. Like America is on the verge of collapsing. He even compares it to Venezuela.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, where, the government has basically fallen apart.
Right.
And those comparisons, they really stick with you.
Yeah, they do. It's like he's trying to tap into these fears people already have
Yeah,
about the economy crashing or, the government becoming a dictatorship.
exactly. And make them feel like the U.S. is headed down that same path.
He uses terms like coup d'etat, police state.
Mm-hmm.
He even calls his opponents seditious.
Wow. These are powerful words,
Yeah, they're not messing around.
No, they're meant to evoke a really strong emotional response. It's about creating this sense of urgency, like danger is right around the corner.
Okay, so then is this kind of rhetoric dangerous? Like, even if he believes what he's saying?
Yeah, that's the thing, even if he's totally sincere. When you start labeling your political opponents as enemies of the state, comparing them to dictators, it creates a really toxic environment.
Yeah, it makes it seem like there's no room for, debate or compromise.
Exactly. Compromise becomes like a betrayal. And, just talking to each other is seen as weakness.
Right, like you're giving in to the enemy. He even says at one point somebody's going to snap. That's a pretty chilling thought.
It is. It really is. It's like he's almost predicting violence. Or even, encouraging it.
As a solution to all this.
Yeah, it's the only way to fix things.
And that's really scary.
It is, because it normalizes violence. It makes it seem like a legitimate way to achieve your political goals.
So then what do we do? I mean, we're bombarded with this stuff all the time.
Right, from all sides.
How do we even know who to trust anymore?
It's tough, but this is where media literacy comes in.
Okay, what does that even mean?
It means developing those skills to, critically evaluate information, to recognize when someone's trying to manipulate your emotions, and to, separate fact from opinion.
That makes sense, but it's easier said than done, right?
It is. It takes practice.
Well, he talks about the mainstream media being dishonest
Oh, yeah, that's a common tactic.
and how people need to get their news from alternative sources.
Like him.
Exactly. It's like he's trying to create his own reality
Yeah.
where only his version of the truth matters.
Right, and that's something we see a lot with, these extreme ideologies. They discredit the mainstream sources, paint them as part of the problem, and then they position themselves as the only ones who have the real truth.
So then people only hear what they want to hear.
Exactly, it creates an echo chamber.
It's like they're trapped in their own little world.
Yeah, and it can be really hard to break out of that.
Okay, so he seems to be speaking to a very specific audience then. Like people who are already feeling angry.
Disillusioned.
Yeah, like the system has failed them somehow.
Exactly, and he validates those feelings, tells them they're not alone.
So they feel like he gets them,
Right, and he offers these simple explanations for complex problems.
which is appealing, I guess.
It is, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed and
What
frustrated.
if he gives them a clear enemy to fight against?
The deep state, the liberals, the media, anyone who doesn't agree with him.
It's all very black and white.
Exactly, there's no nuance.
So then, what can we do? Can we just ignore this and hope it goes away?
I don't think ignoring it will help. In fact, it might even make it worse.
How?
Because these ideas, they spread when they're not challenged. What we need to do is engage with them, but critically.
Okay, so like how do we do that?
We need to point out the flaws in the logic, challenge the assumptions, and offer alternative perspectives.
Okay, but isn't that hard to do?
It is, especially when people are so entrenched in their beliefs.
Right. You keep saying do your homework, like urging people to research these topics themselves.
Right.
But then he only gives links to sources that, agree with him.
Of course, that's how he controls the narrative.
So it's all very biased.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so important to get information from different sources.
Exactly. Diversify your information diet.
Okay, I like that information diet.
Don't rely on just one source for your news, especially one that has a clear agenda.
Right, you need to see all sides of the story.
Exactly. And be willing to challenge your own beliefs.
That's hard.
It is, but it's so important.
Well, he spends a lot of time criticizing the mainstream media. He calls them 30-second sound bites.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that before.
And he says they don't give you enough context to understand these complex issues.
Which is ironic because isn't he oversimplifying things too?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like reducing everything to this civil war between Trump and the deep state. That seems pretty simplistic to me.
It is. It's all about creating these good guys and bad guys and silencing anyone who doesn't fit into that neat little narrative.
Right, so then how do we even talk about these things when there's so much anger and distrust on both sides?
It's tough, but I think it starts with recognizing that we're all human.
Okay,
We might disagree on politics, but we all want what's best for the country,
hopefully.
right? And we need to approach these conversations with empathy.
Instead of just yelling at each other.
Exactly. Listen to understand, not just to respond,
That's good voice.
and be willing to find common ground.
Okay, so he talks about Obama and his supporters. Like they disrupted the smooth transition of power
Oh, yeah, I remember him saying that.
and blames them for the political climate we're in now.
Right, but hasn't there always been tension between outgoing and incoming administrations?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Like, that's kind of part of the process.
Yeah.
And the peaceful transfer of power, isn't that supposed to be like a hallmark of American democracy?
Exactly. So blaming one side seems kind of unfair.
It is. It ignores all the complexities.
He also claims that the deep state is mostly made up of Democrats.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad generalization.
Is there any evidence to back that up?
I haven't seen any. The federal workforce is made up of people from all different backgrounds, all different political beliefs.
So painting it as like this monolithic entity controlled by one party, that's just wrong.
Exactly. It's misleading and inaccurate.
It's like he's saying anyone who works for the government and doesn't support Trump is somehow un-American.
Right, which is a dangerous argument.
Yeah, it undermines the whole idea of a neutral civil service.
Exactly. They're supposed to serve the country no matter who's in charge.
Right.
And this kind of rhetoric creates this climate of fear and suspicion. It discourages people from wanting to work in government.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the problems with this source. But what about us, the listeners? How do we protect ourselves from being manipulated by this kind of language?
That's the key question, right? It comes down to critical thinking, being aware of the tactics they use to manipulate you, to distort your understanding of reality,
Right.
and to shut down anyone who disagrees with them.
So we can't just sit back and passively take in all this information.
No, we have to be active participants.
Question what we hear,
Exactly.
do our own research,
Yes.
and form our own conclusions.
Based on evidence, not just emotion.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
He talks about being well-informed, but then he only points to sources that, support his own views,
Right. It's a classic echo chamber.
where you're only exposed to one side of the story.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to break out of that.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Seek out different perspectives, talk to people who disagree with you, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
I guess that's how we grow.
It is. It's how we learn and evolve.
He seems to think there's only one truth, and anyone who disagrees with him is either stupid or evil.
Yeah, that's a pretty narrow view of the world.
It is.
And it's definitely not how a healthy democracy works.
Right, because a democracy needs debate.
It needs disagreement, it needs compromise.
So silencing those opposing voices, that's dangerous.
It is. It leads to division and ultimately tyranny.
Okay, so then what's the key takeaway from all this? What do we want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is vigilance. We need to be aware of the forces that are trying to divide us, to manipulate our emotions, and to undermine our democratic values.
Right, we can't let them win.
Exactly. We have to fight back.
By being informed, by thinking critically,
Yes, and by engaging in respectful dialogue,
even when it's hard.
even when it's really
He
hard.
talks about the importance of truth, but he only presents one very specific version of it.
Right, his version.
And we have to remember that there are multiple perspectives on every issue,
Exactly. And it's our responsibility to seek them out.
and to think for ourselves.
Exactly.
So we can't just passively consume information
No, we have to be active, we have to question it, we have to challenge it,
and come to our own conclusions.
based on evidence and reason, not fear and emotion.
Well said. Well said. This has been a lot to take in,
It has.
but it's so important. Thanks for walking us through all this.
Of course, it's what I'm here for.
Now, we've talked a lot about the problems with this source's message, but he does offer a solution to this civil war he's so worried about. And it's pretty radical. We'll get into that after.
Oh, no, well, you don't need a break. We can just jump right into it.
You're right. Okay, so what does the voice of reason propose we do about this crisis? Well, he calls for a major house cleaning. And by that, he means targeting the deep state, which he sees as the root of all our problems.
And this isn't just about changing policies or reforming the system. He's talking about getting rid of anyone he sees as an enemy, removing them from power, silencing any opposition. So he's advocating for something pretty extreme here. It goes way beyond just, debating policy or anything like that.
Yeah, he seems to be saying the only way to, save America is to get rid of anyone who doesn't agree with his very specific ideology.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so dangerous. It's not about finding common ground or working together to solve problems. It's about silencing anyone who disagrees with him, consolidating power.
So basically, he's calling for a purge of anyone who doesn't fit his definition of a true patriot.
Basically, yeah. And he even uses language that suggests violence might be necessary to achieve this.
Right, like when he said somebody's going to snap, it's almost like he's saying violence is justified.
Exactly. He's normalizing it, making it seem like an acceptable way to deal with political disputes.
And that creates this really dangerous environment.
It does, because people start to feel like they have to choose sides.
Us versus them.
Exactly, and then violence becomes justifiable if it means defeating the enemy.
But isn't that the opposite of what democracy is supposed to be about?
It is, completely.
I mean, aren't we supposed to be able to disagree and debate and find solutions peacefully?
Exactly. A healthy democracy thrives on that, on diversity of thought, the free exchange of ideas, even passionate disagreements.
Right, because that's how we learn and grow.
It is, but when you start demonizing your opponents and calling for their removal from power, you're basically undermining the very foundation of a democratic society.
So it's like he's saying the ends justify the means.
Yeah, and that's a slippery slope.
It is, because who gets to decide who the enemy is?
Exactly. And what happens to those who are labeled as such?
He seems to think that Trump is the only one who can save America from this deep state takeover,
Right, it's like this cult of personality.
where one man is seen as the savior,
And that's incredibly dangerous.
because it puts all the power in the hands of one person.
Exactly. It eliminates checks and balances, and it creates a breeding ground for authoritarianism.
And that's not what we want.
Definitely not.
He even talks about Trump being outgunned,
Oh, yeah, like he's this lone warrior fighting against all odds.
which makes it even easier to justify extreme measures.
Of course, because then anything goes.
So then how do we protect ourselves from this kind of thinking?
It's all about critical thinking, being aware of the tactics they use.
Okay, like what?
Well, they try to manipulate your emotions, distort your understanding of reality, and shut down any opposition.
So we can't just blindly accept what we hear.
No, we have to question everything.
Do our own research
Exactly.
and form our own conclusions.
Based on evidence and reason, not fear and emotion.
He talks about being well informed, but he only directs people to sources that agree with him.
Right, it's all about controlling the narrative.
So it's like a self-reinforcing cycle.
Exactly, an echo chamber.
And that's why it's so important to break out of that, to seek out different perspectives.
Yes, Talk to people who disagree with you. Challenge your own assumptions.
It's hard though, right?
It is, but it's so important for a healthy democracy.
Because if we all just stay in our own little bubbles, we're never going to understand each other.
Exactly, and that's how division and conflict fester.
Okay, so what's the main takeaway from all this? What do we want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of vigilance. We need to be aware of the forces that are trying to divide us, to manipulate us, to undermine our democracy.
So we can't just be passive observers.
No, we have to be active participants.
We have to question what we hear, think critically, and engage in respectful dialogue.
Exactly, even when it's hard.
Even when we disagree.
Especially when we disagree.
Well said. This has been a lot, but it's been really eye-opening.
I agree. It's important to have these conversations.
Thanks for guiding us through all this.
It was my pleasure. And to our listener, I'll leave you with this thought. What role will you play in shaping the future of our democracy?
That's a good question for all of us to consider. Will we be a force for division or unity? For fear or understanding?
The choice is ours.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions. Until next time, keep diving deep, but always keep those critical thinking caps on.